Hello everyone, welcome. Today is let me check, the 18th of November 2023. I'm going to share with you the notes I had prepared about the history of Palestine and the Israel and the Jews and so on. You remember that I did one or two videos on the very, very beginning. You remember that I show you this book, The Ancient Times, The History of the Early World by Breasted, because this was written in the early 20th century, and it was a textbook in the United States. This is what I have been reading. I'm going to show you the books, okay? Also, The Arabs by Peter Mansfield. A sort of a classic, Judaism by Isidore Epstein. The Legacy of the Ancient World by W.G. de Burgh. A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. And last but not least is this, The Middle East, A Concise History of the Middle East by Arthur Goldshmidt and Lawrence Davidson. And as usual, what I have done is to take notes and then sort of have myself a general idea. I want to tell you, obviously, I don't think I need to emphasize this, that this is not my own research. That is why I'm going to put all these books down below in the the explanation. The books and the authors, so that you might want to purchase these. Okay, but I have to tell you that it's not my own research. Obviously, this is what I want to point out here, is that the work has been done by other people who learn about it, researched it, wrote the book. All I had to do was to read them, which is the easiest thing. Okay, but with so many of them, I've taken notes, and usually I find one that summarizes better than others the whole conflict. So in this case is I'm following the last one, the Middle East, because it talks about how the whole thing started and so on. So that is an introduction, a preamble of what I'm going to say, drawing a little bit from bits and pieces from each author. So let's see. So how did the Arab-Israeli problem begin? Is it a religious war between Judaism and Islam that goes back to the rivalry between the Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael? The Arabs say it is not, and that the Jews were always welcome to settle and prosper in Muslim lands. Now, actually, Ben-Gurion himself, one of the founders of Israel, of the State of Israel, and later Prime Minister, he wrote, prior to the founding of the State of Israel, he wrote a small little booklet that he co-authored with someone else whose name I don't remember, and I didn't write it down. But that little book was not included in his 2-volume collected works. Okay, he says that actually in that particular book that he removed from the collective collected works. In that book, he says that actually the Palestinian people of today were actually the descendants of the Jews who had remained in the land after the destruction of the Second Temple. It was the elite, as it were, that left and dispersed, mainly throughout Eastern Europe for the most part. But that it was actually the poor peasants who remained, who stayed behind. Later, much later, when Islam came in the, this is 6th century AD after Christ, okay, they would eventually convert to Islam, either, out of conviction, but also the politics of the time, that if you did not, you might lose your land anyway. So sometimes you have to do what you have to do to survive. Never mind. But that evolved later, obviously. But that was the very beginning. Ben-Gurion, as I said, did not want to include this little book that he had written in his collected works. But so the Arabs say it is not, okay, a religious war. But the Zionists replied that the Jews under Muslim rule were usually second-class citizens, as well as other non-Muslims anyway. Now, many claim that these arguments stretch back in time, but this is not really accurate. Although claims to Palestine go back hundreds of years, the real context was just starting when World War I broke out. The length and the intensity of what we saw, what we now call the Arab-Israeli or the Arab-Palestinian conflict, was really, oh my goodness, something is falling down here, was largely due, to a large extent, okay, to the rise of nationalism in modern times. Let's see. We actually saw in another video that I did, I discussed the various types of nationalism. You remember you have wholesome patriotism, you also have all kinds of other nationalism, going back to the extreme of Nazism, but you also have anti-colonialist nationalism. Nationalism can be expressed in many different ways, yes, but we could also see it in these two ways: inclusive nationalism and exclusive or exclusive nationalism. So in other words, we people here, we are all alike, we all have the same culture, the same religion, the same God, the same history, the same everything, so we belong together. That is the, let's say, inclusive nationalism. There is another way. All of you out there, you are not like me. So we are here and all of you are different. So all of you there are excluded. It's a different approach, it's a different way of viewing nationalism. Now, obviously, we're talking about culture and language and history and shared memories. Religion is certainly very much part of it. In the case of the Jews, it was to be either religious, something that has been called, and many have called, Messianic Zionism, or political Zionism. We're going to concentrate on political Zionism, which is what is happening today. Though altogether, in a way, putting in front, as it were, Messianic religious Judaism. Okay, let us first defined what Zionism is. Okay, Zionism, I'm reading, is the belief that the Jews constitute a nation, or to use a less loaded term, a people, and that they deserve the same rights as other such groups, including the freedom to return to what they consider their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel or Palestine. Political Zionism is the belief that the Jews should form and maintain a state there. As we all know, and this particular conflict has perhaps enlightened all of us on this point, not, as I said before, not every Jew is a Zionist, and not every Zionist is a Jew. Some Jews identify with the country of which they are citizens and believe that the only meaningful affirmation of Jewishness is the observance of their religion, its laws and its traditions. Jewishness is about religion. And here you certainly have many of the Orthodox rabbis we have been listening to lately that agree with that. Now, many Gentiles, and I would say that perhaps Protestant evangelicals for the most part, believe that the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, or the creation of the State of Israel, must precede the second and even the third coming of Christ, that's as some believe. It's a little bit ridiculous. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that Jesus will come twice, once to take people with him to heaven, then there will be plague and disasters everywhere, and then he will come for a second time, meaning a third time. Okay, that is no, but anyway, it is interpreted by some this way. Now, we Catholics believe that ultimately, and hope and pray for, however, and this was reflected during the ritual in the Mass, as I said in another video, when the old law, the Old Testament, was represented at the beginning of the Mass by having the missal on the right-hand side, okay, meaning the old law, the Old Testament, all the way up to the epistle. And then with great ritual and ceremony, the missal would be changed, genuflecting, singing, praying, to the left side of the altar, and there the gospel and the rest of the Mass. And then at the end of the Mass, just before, again with much ritual, it would be brought to the right-hand side of the altar again, meaning first of all the Jews, and then the Gentiles and the Christians, and then hoping and praying that the Jews would eventually accept and acknowledge the Messiah as the true God, and so on and so forth. Okay, that was the hope and the prayer. I think that some evangelicals interpret this literally as, the Jews having to be in Israel, whereas we Catholics interpret it as the Jews accepting Christ. It doesn't matter whether they are in Israel or wherever they are. Okay, so it's a different interpretation. Okay, so that's one point. Other Gentiles back Israel many times also as, out of guilt for past wrongs committed against them against European Jews. The Ashkenazi, for example, are not from the Semitic race or Semitic language, but from Eastern Europe, so the term anti-Semite is used incorrectly many times. The people of Palestine are Semitic. The Sephardic Jews from Spain were Semitic, but most of the Ashkenazi Jews, the present day, most of them American Jews, are not Semitic. But even some Gentiles who dislike Jews, some are pro-Israel with disguised, perhaps let's use the term anti-Semitism, because it's sort of in a roundabout and disguised way. They want to stress the uniqueness of Jews, as do other opponents. And it opposes the assimilation of Jews into the Gentile society. This was certainly true in the past. I don't know to what extent that happens now. I don't think too much, but one of the books states this. Okay, so likewise, anti-Zionists are not necessarily, let me get the notes, anti-Semites, because, oh my goodness, look at my camera there. Okay, some may even be pro-Arab out of sincere conviction. Some people actually do believe, those who favor Jews, even Jews themselves, and think of Judaism favorably, still think that Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel has done Jews more harm than good. People differ on this. Non-Jews surely must recognize that expressions of opposition or skepticism towards Zionism and Israel do sound, nevertheless, to many Jews anti-Semitic. So this anti-Semitic and Zionist word is full of interpretations and misrepresentations. Now, as to Zionist Jews calling themselves a nation, of course, this is unique in a sense. For example, no one speaks of a Catholic or a Protestant, Protestants calling themselves a nation. But this idea that the Jews are a single and united people is deeply rooted in the Bible. A nomadic tribe, the Hebrews, came to regard their God as the one true God. They were not the first, as we saw in another video. The Egyptians were the first. But nevertheless, this God, he had chosen them for his love and protection because they had chosen him. He had commanded them to keep his covenant and obey his laws from generation to generation. He had led them out of the Egyptian bondage. That was not all of them, it was a tribe, but one of the tribes. The one tribe that was enslaving Egypt. And brought them safely to Canaan, which they called the land of Israel. For he, God, had promised it to the seed of Abraham. Because Arabs as well as Jews claim descent from Abraham, remember Abraham was from Ur, Ur, in the southern part of Iraq nowadays. The term land of Israel restricts its possession to the descendants of Jacob, i.e. the Israelites. Jew originally meant one from Judea. Only later did it take religious significance. Now, the dispersion and the diaspora. For at least 2,000 years, most Jews have not been Judeans. Not even did they speak Hebrew, although they did read the Bible in that language, pretty much as Catholics still read in the Latin. Jews kept their identity as a people through religion, observance of the faith and the laws of Judaism, and by their wish to survive as a people, even without having land, which, by the way, Orthodox rabbis actually say, like, for example, Rabbi David Weiss in New York, who says that we have been punished and we shouldn't have dominion over any land. I'm not going to discuss that because that is Jewish theology, but in any ways, survive as a people without land, without a common tongue because they spoke different languages in different European countries, without a state, and actually without most of the attributes of nationhood. There were always some Jews living in Palestine, and many thought that only those who lived there were actually wholly Jewish. The common anti-Jewish attitude in Europe enhanced Jewish solidarity and identification with the land. Jews in Muslim lands were actually better treated and knew they were free to live in Palestine, but only a few actually did so. Now, moving forward to the beginning of the democratic state and liberal democracy and nation states and so on in Europe, and the Enlightenment before that. There was also a Jewish Enlightenment. In the Hebrew it is called Haskalah, that grew up in the 18th century, leading in Germany and the US to what is called now Reform Judaism, and to a greater assimilation into Western democracy. In other words, this Enlightenment had the same effect, really, that it did in Europe with the Reform Christianity or Protestantism. The new modern world, we could also say, that led to the secular world, where you emphasize reason and rationality and science, and eventually disdaining, shall I say, putting sort of God aside as a superstitious sort of old school thing. We moderns, we do not need all that kind of mumbo-jumbo, as it were. Yeah, reason, rationality, science, that's what counts. You're still believing in God? Oh dear. Okay, no, science, the human mind. Okay, so we abandoned God, the moral law, moral constraints to our behavior. Okay, so here we are, bowing to our new God, science, our reason, ourselves. We made ourselves gods. So fine, look at us now, Westerners worshipping science now and technology, worshipping ourselves. That is what it leads to when you abandon religious belief and pride and arrogance and all the rest of it. And here we are, sort of looking at annihilation and World War III. Wow. Okay. But what we have done is really to steal God's crown and put it on our heads. And even worse, deriving pleasure from doing so, and slapping him on the face and spitting at him. And here we are. Well, never mind. I just want to say that this happened to Christianity, to Christians, and it did happen to Jews too, secular Reformed Jews. Now, this assimilation with liberal democratic countries led a few Jews to deny their Jewishness, and some even converted to Christianity. There are many famous, for example, Heinrich Heine, the writer, and the parents of such famous people as Karl Marx, of Marxism, Mendelssohn, the composer, Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, 19th century, I don't know whether he would have been allowed at the time to be Prime Minister if he were Jewish. I am not sure. Probably not. They would be now, of course. Catholics still can't be Prime Ministers of England, of Great Britain. You can be Hindu. The present Prime Minister is Hindu. You can be anything, Zoroastrian, whatever. But not Catholic. Never mind. All right, so, but you see, the Jews at the time lived in Eastern Europe, especially places like Russia and Poland. And in part of these declining multinational empires of the Habsburgs and the Ottoman Empire. So here, liberal democracy had not taken hold to the same extent as in Western Europe. So when the people of Eastern Europe began to embrace nationalistic ideas, they had to fight against despotic monarchs and nobles to gain their freedom. Now, you know what happens when people are struggling to gain their freedom. The local Jews were actually caught in the middle, keeping themselves to themselves together as a group, as a culture, which is what all let's call them the first immigrants, which is what all immigrants in a foreign land do. They live together, they help one another. Okay, so they become sort of the other, so to speak. Okay, so they were often viewed by nationalists as enemies living among them. Not nationalists, because they were the other, In a word, when things get out of hand, as traitors, as Catholics were viewed, as a matter of fact, as traitors by the English for so many centuries. Okay, so what do you have here? What you have is what you always have in these situations. They tried, many of them, the nationalists, to deflect their anger, their popular anger, from themselves by certainly the leading nobles, to deflect popular anger from themselves by using the Jews, in this case the other, the immigrant, as scapegoats. a few Jews and more than a few Christians said that the only way for the Jews to escape persecution was to move to Palestine and rebuild their state in the land of Israel. Now, this was actually the final agreement during the first Zionist Congress. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Alexander Herzl had considered, for example, Patagonia in Argentina, Uganda even, for the Jews to create a state. And you may say, what? Why? But he wasn't seeing it as in a religious terms as Judaism. He was looking at individual people, Jews who were being persecuted or despised. He was greatly influenced by the Dreyfus affair in France. And so what he wanted was a land where they could go at that particular moment. The ones who were suffering persecution, okay? Now, that is when he said a land without people for a people without a land, which was later repeated by the British politician. But no, so he saw it as a sort of a temporary refuge, as it were. But of course, they were arguing amongst themselves, well, what do you mean temporary refuge? There is no such thing as temporary refuge. People go there, they settle down, they have families and so on. Well, you know, so there was... there were, what was the name? Yes, there was another in the Congress, Aha Adam. It means one of the people. He said that no, it had to be Palestine, because because of its biblical connections and so on. It couldn't just be any town, any country. He actually said this, Aha Adam. He actually said these words, well, not the actual words, but what he meant was, I am really not concerned about individual Jews. I am concerned with Judaism. So it had to be Palestine that they had to go to because, as I said, of its biblical connections. So you see, we already see here two paths, as I understand it. Nationalism being viewed as according to religion, identified with Judaism, and nationalism according to people and specific political situations, in other words, political Zionism. So the idea that Jews constitute a nation, Zionism by our previous definition, that is nothing new. But saying that the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, should revive its ancient state in Palestine, and that is political Zionism, was indeed actually quite revolutionary in the 19th century. So let us look at the beginning of political Zionism. Like most revolutionary doctrines, political Zionism started with a few supporters. Most rabbis said that the Jews could not be restored to the land of Israel until after God had sent the Messiah. Some called nationalism a form of collective self-love that ran counter to Judaism's basic commandment. and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, from Deuteronomy, etc. However, Moses Hess, one of the first German socialists, argued in a book called Rome and Jerusalem in 1862 that Jews could form a truly socialist state in the land of Israel. We're beginning to see here politics beginning to be mixed in. This book, which was very influential, written in 1862, remember that Proudhon, the anarchist, all property is theft, and the Saint Simonians, the followers of sort of a beginning of socialism, they all lived in communes at the time in the 1830s. They were against industrialization, and they wanted to go back to the land and the village and so on, the old ways, okay? And they were really the first socialists, and they all lived in communes, and that is why they were all called communists, okay? So remember also, the book is 1862. Remember the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, written in 1848. So socialism and socialistic ideas are very much on the forefront at the moment. So he wrote this, Moses Hess wrote this book, Rome and Jerusalem, and he says the Jews, as I said, could form a socialist state in the land of Israel. Leon Pinzer wrote another book, Auto-Emancipation, in 1882, and had immense influence in Russia. The Tsarist regime at the time was implementing the so-called May laws, which restricted Russian areas where the Jews might not live, and so on. The first exclusionary, no, you're not part of us, you're different, etc., etc. All those laws. Now, this book might have been the first one, or one of the first ones, to argue that Jews were vulnerable to anti-Semitism. Not that they had not been. Not that anyone had disagreed with that, but they were vulnerable to anti-Semitism because, and this is what is different, they lacked a country of their own. This was very influential in Russia amongst Russian Jews. It inspired them to form Zionist clubs and study groups in Russia. And these study groups and clubs and so on, they created a federation, and this federation was called the Lovers of Zion. And it spread from Russia to other countries where Jews lived. Another more activist movement, the BILU, that is for... It's written in Hebrew, but anyway, it means, to the house of Jacob go, and we will follow. And this movement sent groups of young Russian Jews to Palestine. Immigrants in these two organizations made up what historians of Zionism called the first Aliyah. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Aliyah, Aliyah, A-L-I-Y-A. Aliyah really means going up. The term that Jews had long used for going to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem, set among the Judean hills. But it really came to mean going to the land of Israel. Now, the early Jewish settlers, Jewish immigrants, were called Olim, ascenders. And these Olim found other Jewish newcomers in Palestine when they got there. scholars and mystics going to Jerusalem and other places of Jewish culture. And there were already immigrants there buying land and farming it. In the late 19th century, the total number, we are told, of Jewish settlers in Palestine was less than 20,000. The local inhabitants numbered, we're talking about the late 19th century, okay? The local inhabitants were about 570,000 and spoke Arabic. The land itself was governed by the Ottoman Empire, which was, I think many historians agree, inefficient and corrupt and suspicious of Jews. Many Jews actually quit and left in disgust and went home, and most to the United States. One word before I move on. I'm going to probably stop after this, but just one word about Theodor Herzl, one of the founders. A Zionism based solely on Russian resources would not have lasted very long. What gave the movement endurance and a wider appeal was the work of a Jewish journalist living in Vienna, Theodor Herzl, who in 1896 wrote The Jewish State, a book. He wrote other things, but The Jewish State. And this was a plea for political Zionism. He was a popular writer, and his books carried the ideas of Pinster and other to a lot of German-speaking Jews. So he called the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland in 1897. And I'm just going to read you one of the, it's not very long, just one or two paragraphs. At its conclusion, the conferees adopted the following resolution. The goal of Zionism is the establishment for the Jewish people of a home in Palestine guaranteed by public law. The Congress anticipates the following means to reach that goal. 1. The promotion, in suitable ways, of the colonization of Palestine by Jewish agricultural and industrial workers. 2. The organizing and uniting of all Jews by means of suitable institutions, local and international, in compliance with the laws of all countries. 3. The strengthening and encouraging of Jewish national sentiment and awareness. 4. Introducing moves towards receiving governmental approval where needed for the realization of Zionism's goal. Okay. Now, he wrote more books, as I said. He made many speeches courting support from rich Jews and some European governments as well, and also from the Jewish middle class. At one point, he even got an offer, believe it or not, from the British. Where's my notes? Whoops. Yes, from the British government. Here she comes, England, sometimes called perfidious Albion. Anyway, and they actually proposed first something that was called the Uganda scheme. And this would let the Zionists settle in what later would be called the Kenya's White Highlands. But most of Herzl followers, especially the Russian Jews, refused. They said there cannot be Zionism without Zion. And the movement split. And when he died, Herzl, in 1904, it seemed as if his high hopes would never be realized. The second Aliyah, ascending, the second largest scale, or coming to Israel, the second largest scale immigration of Jews from Russia following its abortive revolution, the revolution of 1905. That is when it happened. Most decided to seek freedom and opportunity in what they called, and also Eastern Europeans, not just Russians, in what they call the Goldena Medina, a Yiddish word for land of gold, overseas. And that would be in the United States mainly. The land of gold would be mainly the United States. A small number of the more idealistic ones chose Palestine instead. And this is the second Aliyah, which took place between 1905 and 1914. They built a community in Palestine. They eventually had their own, in community, they had their own schools and newspapers and trade unions and worker-owned factories. Socialism, and political parties. The Arabs were not allowed to join, obviously, and none tried to. Because so many of them spoke different languages, though, according to the country they had come from, the Olim made a concerted effort to revive Hebrew as a spoken and written language that they could all share. Their most famous achievement was a novel experiment in agricultural settlement called the kibbutz. That means a collective farm, in which all houses, animals, and farming equipment belonged to a group, the commune, or the cooperatives, as a whole, not to individuals. All decisions were made democratically, and all jobs, including cooking, cleaning, and child rearing, were shared by the members. That is exactly what the French Commune had done. They came to represent the Jewish entrepreneurial spirit, but many of them moved out of cities because of this, especially they went to Tel Aviv. And the kibbutniks were determined to develop their lands, and they bought it. Sorry, I'm not reading my notes very well. They were helped to buy them or bought for them by the Jewish National Fund, which would buy them from a corrupt Ottoman Empire, who would sell to the highest bidder, as it were. And it was bought for them from absentee Arabs and Turkish landlords. And if you remember an old video of mine where I was explaining about what happened in Spain with the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, you will see the connections, because how I don't want to repeat the whole thing, but how not the nobles or the aristocrats or the kings hated or despised the Jews at all. It came, as in Eastern Europe, it came from the bottom because of old laws that were there. You see, the Christians were fighting the Arabs for so long. It was your moral duty to go and fight for the reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. And you had to abandon your land. But because of an old law similar to this one, that if the land remained fallow for over a year, it was no longer yours. Anyone could buy it. So the people came from fighting at the front there, and they came back to the village, and the land was not theirs anymore. What do you mean it's not mine? It has always been. No. It belonged to the local Jew. The Jews did not have to go to war. They were not Christians. It was not their thing. And no one expected them to. Okay? So they bought it, and they bought it legally. But because of this bad law and people in power not listening, this, again, the same thing. It was the Jews who had bought the land who were actually being despised. I see the same thing happening here. Okay, so they bought the land from the Ottoman Empire, okay, and the land belonged to absentee Arabs and Turkish landlords. Okay. Now, but because they kept themselves to themselves too, they didn't sort of resort to cheap Arab peasant labor at all. It was, if you want to see it that way, it was Jewish self-reliance. But it was also a small step towards exclusion of Arab Palestinians from their homeland. Now, soon, a lot of them lost this zeal for socialism or for working the land, like these hot summers, windy and rainy winters, malaria, swamps, rocky hills, sandy desert soil, frequent crop failures. They began to lose their fervor, as it were. And also Arab raiders and peasants raided the kibbutz many times. Their cousins in Gaza and Jerusalem started looking at them with great suspicion. Gradually, they became to see it as colonization that was dispossessing them and reduced them to second-class citizens themselves, to second-class status. That is how they were beginning to see what was happening. The Palestinians were already protesting in the press and in the Ottoman parliament against these foreign settlers and their plans to build a Jewish state in Palestine. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government, in fact, both before and after the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, obstructed Jewish colonization because they were concerned actually about adding yet another nationality problem to those in the Balkans and other Arab lands that were already tearing the Ottoman Empire apart. Let me finish with this. In the next video, I'm going to do 2 or 3. Okay, in the next video, I will bring in Britain and the British Mandate. We all know about it now, but it sort of in a little bit of a greater detail. But at that time, no European government would risk, at that time, offending Istanbul by just simply supporting Jewish settlements in Palestine. And now, here comes England. And I will leave that for tomorrow's video. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.